It was the summer of 1992, and the Whiskey A Go-Go on Sunset Boulevard was about to witness something that no one in the crowd of 800 people could have possibly predicted. Ronnie James Dio, the man whose voice could shatter glass and resurrect the dead in equal measure, had just stepped onto that legendary stage beside the one person in rock and roll who feared absolutely nothing and no one, Lemmy Kilmister. The two of them had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon, tucked into a corner booth at the Rainbow Bar and Grill just a few doors down, and somewhere between the 7th round of Jack Daniels and a conversation about why modern metal had lost its soul, they decided to do something reckless, something beautiful, something that would either become the greatest unannounced performance of the decade or the most violent disaster the Sunset Strip had seen since the riots. What neither of them knew, as Lemmy plugged his Rickenbacker into a borrowed Marshall stack, and Dio gripped the microphone with both hands like a man preparing for war, was that 3 blocks away, a white limousine was carrying someone who would turn their brotherhood into a battlefield. Axl Rose had heard about the show. Axl Rose was coming. And when Axl Rose walked through that door 45 minutes later with 2 bodyguards and a bottle of vodka, the 800 fans packed into that sweat-soaked room would witness a confrontation so explosive, so raw, and so deeply personal that the Whiskey A Go-Go staff would refuse to speak about it for nearly 30 years. But the real question was never about who threw the first punch or who grabbed the microphone. The real question, the one that haunted everyone who was there that night, was what Dio whispered to Axl Rose in the darkness backstage. A single sentence that made one of the most dangerous men in rock and roll turn pale and walk away without saying a word. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because every week we uncover the untold stories behind rock and roll's most legendary and most dangerous moments. To understand what happened on that stage in 1992, you first need to understand the bond between Ronnie James Dio and Lemmy Kilmister, because it was not the kind of friendship that most people would recognize. It was built on whiskey, mutual respect, and a shared hatred for everything fake in the music industry. The two men had first crossed paths in the early 1970s, when Dio was still fronting Rainbow, and Lemmy was fresh off his humiliating firing from Hawkwind. They met at a dingy club in North London, where both happened to be drinking on the same Tuesday night, and according to people who were there, they argued about Black Sabbath for 3 hours straight before buying each other a round and deciding they were brothers for life. Lemmy later said that Dio was the only singer he ever respected who was shorter than his bass guitar, and Dio responded by calling Lemmy the only bass player in the world who played like he was trying to punish the audience for existing. By 1992, both men were navigating complicated chapters in their careers. Dio had recently left Black Sabbath for the second time, and the critics were writing think pieces about whether his voice had lost its magic. Lemmy, meanwhile, was doing what Lemmy always did, touring relentlessly with Motorhead, drinking a bottle of Jack Daniels every single day, and refusing to acknowledge that the grunge revolution in Seattle had any relevance whatsoever to real music. They had developed a ritual over the years whenever they were both in Los Angeles at the same time, meeting at the Rainbow Bar and Grill, sitting in the corner booth that Lemmy had claimed as his personal territory since the mid-70s, drinking until the sun came up. It was during one of these sessions, on a scorching afternoon in July of '92, that the idea was born. Dio mentioned that he missed the raw energy of playing small clubs, and Lemmy looked at him across the table and said they should walk down to the whiskey and just play. No announcement, no setlist, no rules, just 2 old warriors reminding the world what real heavy metal sounded like before MTV got its hands on it. The owner of the Whiskey A Go-Go that night was not expecting what walked through his door at around 9:30 in the evening. A mid-week booking of a local cover band was about to be interrupted by 2 of the most legendary figures in heavy metal history, and within 20 minutes of word getting out, the sidewalk outside was packed with people trying to get in. The cover band handed over their equipment without hesitation, and Lemmy strapped on a battered Fender precision bass, while Dio took the microphone with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 30 years commanding audiences 10 times this size. They did not have a plan. They did not have a drummer. What they had was something far more dangerous, which was two men with nothing to prove and nothing to lose, fueled by enough Jack Daniels to tranquilize a horse, standing on the same stage where the Doors had played their first residency. The first song was a raw, stripped-down version of a Motorhead classic, and Dio sang it like he was channeling something ancient and furious from deep inside his chest. The crowd, which had swelled to nearly 800 people crammed into a room designed for 400, responded with a primal roar that you only hear when people realize they are witnessing something that will never happen again. Lemmy stood at the edge of the stage with his bass slung impossibly low, his head tilted back at that signature 45-degree angle, his fingers hammering the strings with brutal precision. Between songs, he took a long pull from a bottle of Jack Daniels, lit a Marlboro, and nodded at Dio with a look that said they both knew this was exactly where they were supposed to be. The heat inside the whiskey was suffocating, the walls were sweating, and the sound was so loud that people on Sunset Boulevard 3 doors down could feel it in their teeth. For about 45 minutes, everything was perfect. Two legends, one stage, and a crowd that understood they were seeing something sacred. But what nobody in that room knew was that the most unpredictable man in rock and roll had just pulled up to the curb outside in a white stretch limousine, and he was not in a good mood. Axl Rose in 1992 was at the absolute peak of his power, riding the monstrous success of Use Your Illusion 1 and 2, with Guns N' Roses arguably the biggest rock band on the planet. But Axl was also in the middle of one of the most chaotic periods of his life. The Use Your Illusion tour had been plagued by his infamous late arrivals, sometimes keeping 60,000 fans waiting for hours. Riots had broken out at multiple shows. Lawsuits were piling up. His relationships within the band were fracturing, with Slash and Duff McKagan growing increasingly frustrated with his erratic behavior. On this particular night, Axl had been at a party in the Hollywood Hills when someone mentioned that Dio and Lemmy were playing an unannounced set at the Whiskey. Something about that information got under his skin. Some people later speculated that it was jealousy, that Axl could not stand the idea of two legends creating a moment without him on the Sunset Strip, which he considered his territory. Others said he was simply drunk and looking for a stage. Whatever the reason, Axl Rose decided he was going to the Whiskey, and when Axl Rose decided something in 1992, the universe had two choices: get out of the way or get destroyed. He arrived with 2 bodyguards and a bottle of Stolichnaya vodka that was already half empty. The doorman took one look at Axl's face and stepped aside. Axl pushed through the crowd, his red bandana pulled low over his eyes, his leather jacket catching the stage lights as he moved toward the front. People recognized him immediately, and a ripple of excitement and anxiety moved through the room. This was the man who had started a riot in St. Louis by jumping into the crowd to fight a fan. This was the man who had kept 70,000 people waiting in Montreal until they tore the stadium apart. And he was now standing 15 feet from a stage where Dio and Lemmy were in the middle of a performance that had nothing to do with him. The people closest to Axl could see it in his eyes. He was not there to watch. He was there to take over. But what Axl did not understand was that the two men on that stage were not the kind who moved aside for anyone. Lemmy had once told a journalist that he would rather die on stage than give an inch to someone who had not earned the right to stand there. And Dio, for all his grace, had a spine made of the same steel that forged his voice. It started not with a shout but with a gesture. Axl Rose, standing at the front of the crowd with his vodka in one hand and his bodyguards flanking him like sentinels, began waving at the stage. Not waving like a fan, waving like a man summoning a waiter, a dismissive, impatient motion that said he wanted something and he wanted it now. Dio saw it first. He was between songs, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and he caught the motion in his peripheral vision. For a moment, Dio just stared at Axl with an expression that people who were there later described as the look a father gives a child who has just done something spectacularly stupid. Lemmy, who was lighting another Marlboro with his back half turned to the crowd, had not yet noticed. Axl then did something that changed the temperature of the entire room. He climbed onto the stage, not from the side where the stairs were. He pulled himself up from the front, hoisting his body over the monitor speakers with the athletic confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times, and he walked directly toward the microphone stand with his arms outstretched, as if the stage had been waiting for him all along. The crowd erupted, but not in the way Axl expected. There were cheers from some, the Guns N' Roses fans who recognized a moment of rock star theater, but there were also boos, loud and unmistakable, from the people who understood that what Dio and Lemmy had been building for the last 45 minutes was something delicate and rare, and that Axl Rose had just stomped into the middle of it like a bull crashing through a cathedral. Lemmy turned around slowly, the cigarette still hanging from his lip, and when he saw Axl Rose standing center stage with his hand on the microphone, something shifted behind his eyes. It was not anger exactly. It was something colder than anger, something more ancient. It was the look of a man who had spent 50 years refusing to be pushed around by anyone, from the headmaster who expelled him from school at 15 to the Hawkwind bandmates who betrayed him in Canada, and who was not about to start accommodating the tantrums of a man half his age. Lemmy did not say a word. He simply took 2 steps forward, positioned himself directly in front of Axl, and turned the volume on his bass up to a level that made the monitors howl with feedback. The message was clear: this stage belongs to us. You are not welcome here. Axl, to his credit or perhaps to his detriment, did not back down. He grabbed the microphone and began talking to the crowd, something about how this was the Sunset Strip, and every great musician deserved to be on this stage. And for about 15 seconds it seemed like he might actually charm his way into the performance. But then Dio stepped forward. And when Ronnie James Dio stepped forward with intention, when he planted his feet and squared his shoulders and locked his eyes onto yours, it was like watching a 5'4" earthquake take human form. Dio did not grab the microphone back. He did not shout. He simply stood next to Axl, looked up at him with those dark, ancient eyes and began to sing. He sang without amplification, without the microphone, his voice cutting through the noise and the feedback and the confusion like a blade made of pure crystal. The crowd fell silent. Axl fell silent. Even Lemmy, who had been preparing for a physical confrontation, paused with his hand still on the volume knob of his bass. Because the thing about Dio's voice was that it was not just loud. It was not just technically perfect. It was something that transcended performance and entered the territory of the sacred, and when he aimed it at you from 3 feet away, it felt less like music and more like judgment. Axl stood there, the microphone still in his hand, and for the first time in perhaps his entire adult life, he looked uncertain. What happened next depends on who you ask. Some people who were there say that Axl tried to sing along, that he opened his mouth and attempted to match Dio note for note, and that the comparison was so brutally unfavorable that even his own bodyguards winced. Others say that Lemmy stepped between them, put one hand on Axl's chest, and physically guided him toward the edge of the stage with the calm authority of a bouncer who finds this particular troublemaker unimpressive. What everyone agrees on is that the crowd began to chant. It started in the back of the room, a low rumble that built until it became a roar. They were chanting 2 words, Dio, Lemmy, over and over with the kind of conviction that turns a crowd into a tribe. It was not a rejection of Axl Rose the musician. It was a rejection of Axl Rose the intruder, and the crowd was letting him know in the most public way possible that he had miscalculated badly. Axl's face changed. The confidence dissolved, and in its place came something that the people closest to the front recognized immediately. It was rage. Pure, unfiltered thermonuclear rage. Axl threw the microphone at the floor, where it bounced and sent a shriek of feedback through the speakers that made the entire room flinch. He turned toward Lemmy and said something that the crowd could not hear but that several people near the stage later reported as a threat. Lemmy's response, according to multiple witnesses, was to take a long, slow drink of Jack Daniels, blow cigarette smoke in Axl's general direction, and smile. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had survived Hawkwind's betrayal, 50 years of speed and whiskey, and the entire British music industry trying to bury him, and who found the threat of a 30-year-old with anger issues to be genuinely amusing. Axl's bodyguards moved in, not to protect Axl from Lemmy, but to protect Axl from himself. They guided him toward the side of the stage, and Axl went with them, but he went backward, keeping his eyes locked on Lemmy the entire time. The show continued. Dio and Lemmy played for another 30 minutes after Axl was escorted off the stage, and the energy in the room was unlike anything anyone had experienced before. It was charged with the electricity of confrontation, the relief of resolution, and the deep satisfaction of watching two genuine legends refuse to be intimidated by the biggest rock star on the planet. Lemmy played with even more ferocity than before, and Dio sang like a man who had just proven a point he had been waiting his entire career to make. The crowd was delirious. People were crying, screaming lyrics they did not know to songs they had never heard. It was one of those rare moments in live music where the boundary between performer and audience dissolves completely, and everyone in the room becomes part of the same beating heart. But while all of this was happening on stage, something else was happening in the narrow corridor behind the Whiskey's backstage area, and this is the part of the story that almost nobody knows about. Axl Rose had not left the building. His bodyguards had guided him off the stage and through the backstage door, but Axl had planted himself in the hallway and refused to move. He was packing back and forth, fists clenched, breathing rapid and shallow, and according to one of the Whiskey's sound engineers who was trapped in the hallway, Axl was talking to himself in a low monologue that alternated between fury and something that sounded almost like hurt. The sound engineer later said that what struck him most was not the anger but the vulnerability underneath it, the sense that Axl Rose was a man who could not handle being told he was not wanted. This was the same man who had been abandoned by his biological father, abused by his stepfather, and who had spent his entire life building a fortress of aggression around a core of pain he could never extinguish. And tonight, two men he genuinely admired had looked him in the eye and told him he did not belong. When the show ended and Dio walked through the backstage door, he nearly collided with Axl in the hallway. The two bodyguards tensed. The sound engineer pressed himself against the wall, but Dio did something that no one expected. He stopped, looked up at Axl Rose and put his hand on the younger man's shoulder, not aggressively, gently, almost paternally, and then he leaned in close and whispered something directly into Axl's ear. Only Axl heard it, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The color drained from his face, his fists unclenched, his shoulders dropped. He stared at Dio for what witnesses estimated was somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds, which does not sound like a long time until you have stood in a dark hallway watching two rock legends locked in a silent exchange that contains the weight of entire lifetimes. Then Axl Rose turned around and walked out the back exit without saying a word. His bodyguards exchanged a look of pure confusion and followed him into the alley where the white limousine was still waiting. The door closed, the engine started, and Axl Rose disappeared into the Los Angeles night. For decades, the mystery of what Ronnie James Dio whispered to Axl Rose in that hallway has been the subject of endless speculation among people who were there, and among the wider rock community that eventually heard the story through the underground network of roadies, sound engineers, and bartenders who serve as the true historians of rock and roll. Dio himself never revealed what he said. When journalists asked him about the incident in later years, he would smile that enigmatic smile of his and say that some things are between two men and should stay that way. Lemmy, who was less diplomatic about virtually everything, once hinted that Dio had told Axl something about the difference between being feared and being respected, and that the truth of it had hit Axl like a freight train because deep down he already knew it. Others believe it was something far more personal, something about Axl's childhood, something that Dio had intuited without being told and had offered back not as a weapon but as a mirror. Whatever the words were, their effect was undeniable. In the weeks and months that followed, several people close to Axl noted a change in how he talked about Dio. Before that night, Axl had rarely mentioned Dio in interviews. After that night, Axl began citing Dio as one of the greatest vocalists in rock history, and on at least one occasion he told a journalist that Dio had more power in his little finger than most singers had in their entire careers. He never explained the reversal. He never mentioned the whiskey incident publicly, but the people who knew. Something had shifted in the tectonic plates beneath Axl Rose's understanding of himself and his place in the hierarchy of rock and roll, and the man who caused that shift was a 5'4" singer from New Hampshire who never needed to raise his voice to make his point. The Whiskey A Go-Go incident of 1992 never became a major headline. There were no smartphones in '92, no social media to amplify the story into viral territory within hours. What existed was word of mouth, the oldest and most powerful form of storytelling in human history, and through that ancient medium, the story of the night Dio and Lemmy stood their ground against Axl Rose spread through the rock community like a slow-burning fire that never went out. It became one of those stories that musicians told each other on tour buses at 3 in the morning, a parable about what it meant to have true authority versus borrowed power. Dio never needed a limousine and 2 bodyguards to command a room. Lemmy never needed anything more than a bass, a bottle, and the willingness to die on his feet rather than live on his knees. Ronnie James Dio passed away on May the 16th, 2010, from stomach cancer at 67 years old. Lemmy Kilmister followed him on December the 28th, 2015, just 4 days after his 70th birthday, taken by an aggressive cancer diagnosed only 2 days before his death. Axl Rose continued to lead Guns N' Roses through decades of lineup changes and the kind of career turbulence that would have destroyed anyone with less raw talent. But those who pay close attention to the history of rock and roll, those who listen to the stories that roadies tell and the memories that bartenders keep, know that somewhere in the tangled web of relationships and rivalries that defined the golden age of heavy metal, there was one night on the Sunset Strip when 2 old warriors proved that the loudest voice in the room is not always the one screaming. Sometimes it is the one that whispers. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, you get to hear what it says.